Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me. It is a great pleasure to moderate this morning the offshore wind to tackle Europe's climate and energy security crisis session here at the European Sustainable Energy Week. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, colleagues and friends, my name is Roland Rösch. I'm director of the Innovation and Technology Center, and this is my privilege to speak here on behalf of the International Renewable Energy Agency, as I said, as director of the Innovation and Technology Center. IRENA is a global intergovernmental agency dedicated to the sustainable development and use of all forms of renewable energy. We are facing a dual crisis of climate change and energy security. The transition to low carbon sustainable future has never been more critical, as we have heard also yesterday and this morning. Combating this crisis is our collective responsibility. Offshore wind energy offers a critical solution in this endeavor and contributes significantly to the European Union's ambition on climate and energy target. It is an honor to address this room filled with public authorities, energy agencies, industry association, businesses, civil society organization, and esteemed colleagues from the Global Offshore Wind Alliance. We all share the commitment to make the transition to a low-carbon, sustainable future happen. An important asset in our hands to achieve this goal is the untapped potential of offshore wind energy, which will be discussed in this session today. The European Union is a pioneer in offshore wind energy. It is its commitment to renewable energy and decarbonization in the line with the Paris Agreement sets a benchmark for the world. Collectively, we are facing a gigantic task requiring us to diversify energy sources and accelerate the shift to renewables. It is here that at this juncture that offshore wind energy emerges as a light of hope, offering a clean, reliable and scalable solution that promises to stimulate local economies and foster innovation. The formation of the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, or also called GOWA, was prompted by this very need to tap into the potential of wind energy. GOWA has a transformative vision. It is a testament to our collective desire to lead change. With strong representation in the European Union, GOWA is ready to drive the necessary energy transition, foster knowledge exchange, drive innovative solutions, and contribute significantly to our fight against climate change and energy security. Today, I invite here to join us in this endeavor. By fostering cooperation between governments, industry associations, businesses, and the private sector, we can set a new direction for our energy future. IRENA's flagship, the World Energy Transition Outlook, paints a clear picture of the strategy needed to limit global temperature. A global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels and achieve net zero CO2 emissions by the mid of the century. Offshore wind energy emerges as critical component of this strategy. It offers the prospects of a just energy transition by job creation, supply chain development, and also export opportunities. We must continue to forge partnerships, drive collaborations, and build offshore wind systems that resonate with the aspirations of our economies and communities. Ladies and gentlemen, as we stand at the beginning of a new era, let us harness the power of the wind and the boundless energy of the sea. As the European Commissioner for Energy, Kadri Simpson, rightly pointed out during the first day of the European Sustainable Energy Week, homegrown green energy and energy efficiency are the only solutions to cheaper, cleaner, and more secure energy in the long term. Indeed, as we set out on this journey, this is the path we need to treat. Our focus must be on enhancing our renewable energy capabilities, a strategy where offshore wind energy promises to play a significant role. Let us be driving force that propels GOA's ambition forward. Let us act for our future, for future generations, and for the planet as we call home and join GOA in harnessing the winds of change for a bright tomorrow. Thank you very much for this. I will now move on, dive deeper into offshore wind energy as a key solution to climate and energy security crisis globally in Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, first I would like to say a few more words about the International Renewable Energy Agency. We are founded in 2000. No, that's not. We are founded in 2011. We have grown to include 160 member countries. With the 160 member countries, we were probably the fastest growing agency globally. With more than 60 more countries in the process of joining us, our network spans the globe with offices in Abu Dhabi and in Bonn and in New York. At IRENA, our mission is very clear. We are committed to promoting the widespread adoption of renewable energy, as far these energy forms are sustainable. We firmly believe that the future of energy is renewable. Our mandate to facilitate this global transition towards a more sustainable and secure and low carbon economy. We aim to make energy accessible to all, reducing energy poverty and bringing about an inclusive and equitable energy transition. But we understand that this transition isn't just about energy, it is also about building resilient economies, societies that can withstand the challenges of the future. This is why economic growth and prosperity form an integral part of our mission. IRENA, with its global reach and dedicated mission, is committed to making this future a reality. Today, we are to discuss a matter of the utmost importance and urgency of climate change and energy security. As we confront these obstacles, we discover a potent solution in offshore wind energy. Our journey towards a sustainable, low-carbon future is not merely an option or alternative, it is a mandate. Wind, which has been a lifeline for mariners for centuries, has the potential to become a lifeline for the global energy system. At IRENA, we work in multiple work streams with our member states towards realizing offshore wind immense potential as reliable and sustainable source of energy. It is not enough to replace fossil fuels with a renewable energy source. This transition represents a paradigm shift towards greater resilience and sustainability in our energy landscape. With each offshore wind turbine that we will install, we demonstrate our commitment to a future that is not only cleaner and greener, but also secure and sustainable. Harnessing the power of the wind is also a demonstration of our ability to work in harmony with nature. As technology advances, our capacity to harness the vast offshore wind energy potential grows. In doing so, we make offshore wind an energy pillar of our fight against climate change and our pursuit of energy security. Moving on, offshore wind is an integral part of Europe's renewable energy ecosystems. It represents a shift towards an area where renewable energy will not just be means to power homes and businesses, but a way to stimulate economic growth, create jobs, and foster social development. As part of this commitment, the European Union is fostering a strong focus on offshore wind energy with targets to reach 111 gigawatt by the end of this decade and 317 gigawatt by 2050. Offshore wind energy is in this regard seen not only as the resource but also as a significant driver of economies and jobs. It involves building robust, resilient, and sustainable energy system that can meet the future challenges. Offshore wind energy is in this regard seen not only as a resource but also as a significant driver for economies and jobs. By discussing offshore wind energy in the European context, we move on from the mere notion of substituting fossil fuel power plants with wind farms. We envision a comprehensive transformation of our energy landscape, a paradigm shift that marries technological innovation and ecological integrity. With the rise of offshore wind energy, we are stepping into a new era of renewable energy. It is an era defined by innovation, sustainability, and resilience. An era where wind energy not only powers our homes and businesses, but also catalyzes economic growth and societal development. Working closely currently with the G20 also now at the moment, we did under the G20 presidency leadership of Italy and report of offshore wind that kind of opened, let's say, the perspective and the agenda of the G20 to look into the potentials and the possibilities that this technology offers to the G20. Under the current G7 presidency of Japan, we are looking also into an offshore wind analysis that looks into floating offshore wind and tries to address let's say, also the interest of stakeholders like fisheries and how a way can be found that floating offshore wind can coexist with nearshore stakeholders. IRENA also has a collaborative framework, offshore renewables. In this collaborative framework, offshore renewables, we closely discuss together with stakeholder, policymakers, practitioners, also with partners like GWEC and Ocean Energy Europe. We develop products that support the implementation of offshore wind, but also of offshore energy, other offshore energy technologies. These products support and promote the technology and help to implement faster offshore wind products and to faster implement offshore wind turbines in the sea. As we confront the challenges and investigate the opportunities presented by offshore wind energy, it is evident that our path forward must be characterized by increased collaboration and collective action. This is the guiding principle of the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, which serves as a rallying point for public and private stakeholders. GOWA's mission goes beyond merely promoting offshore wind energy. It aims to be a collaborative platform where knowledge, expertise, and resources are pooled to expedite the global next generation. Together we can construct a secure, sustainable, and equitable deployment of offshore wind energy. We invite you to join this global alliance, not only as participants, but also as change agents and catalysts globally. Together we can transform our energy future by harnessing the wind power. This is more than a goal or aspiration. It is an absolute necessity for the survival of our planet and energy future. I now hand over to Mr. Bruce Douglas from GWEC for an overview of GOWA. Please, Bruce, come here on the floor. Thank you very much.
Roland, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, what a pleasure it is to be here today as the role of the CEO of the Global Renewables Alliance and also representing the Global Wind Energy Council. It's in fact my first formal appearance on behalf of those organizations. The Global Renewables Alliance was recently established to be the single voice representing the renewables industry internationally, working very closely with many stakeholders, including, of course, IRENA. So the Global Offshore Wind Alliance was founded by Denmark, IRENA, and the Global Wind Energy Council to create a global community to accelerate the rollout of offshore wind to 380 gigawatts by 2030 and 2,000 gigawatts by 2050. When I started in the wind industry almost 25 years ago, there was only 20,000 megawatts installed globally, onshore and offshore. There's now over 1 million megawatts, 1 terawatt of wind energy, a huge and important milestone for the wind industry. GOWA now comprises 12 countries. You can see them listed here. The national governments of Denmark, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, UK, Japan, USA, Colombia, Norway, the Netherlands, Germany, and St. Lucia, and many more are now in progress. GOWA is an alliance with public-private partnerships as a founding principle. It provides a multi-stakeholder platform to bring different sectors together to address the shared challenges of offshore wind, and empowers these groups to work together to reach positive solutions. It considers public policy alongside the journey of sector delivery and bringing in supportive wider stakeholders. GOWA brings together concrete work streams and diplomatic efforts. It seeks to create dialogues that can feed into key diplomatic moments, for example, COP28. The workstream outputs, which I'll mention in a moment, will feed into these moments. The non-country membership of GOWA is expanding and will include actors from the private sector, as well as multilaterals, knowledge institutions, and NGOs. Countries and other actors recognize the value of being part of a group pushing forward offshore wind. This has benefits in terms of steering the international conversation on this issue, which is rising in importance in international negotiations. There are also potential trade and industrial benefits which can be realized through cooperation on this topic. Members of GOWA also see the benefit of access to support on the domestic offshore wind agenda, peer-to-peer learning and lessons from mature markets. Private sector sees great value in being able to share expertise on how best to leverage private investment to deploy offshore wind. Here's the call for action, which the members sign up to, including individual commitments from each member. So in terms of next steps, GOWA invites applications for membership from emerging and mature offshore wind markets, other stakeholders, and private entities. We believe in the strength of uniting various stakeholders. It will leverage synergies with other initiatives and be a platform for sharing. GOWA does not aim to duplicate existing efforts, rather it seeks to map and connect existing work on offshore wind at a global level, including any regional approaches and initiatives of relevance. Here are some initial initiatives which have been mapped. The IRENA collaborative initiative mentioned by Roland, the Global Wind Energy Council, Offshore Wind Task Force, and the Global Renewables Alliance. The ambition is for GOWA to provide a clearinghouse platform for all efforts on offshore wind. In terms of future activities, GOWA is now operationalizing and is executing plans to put in place a steering committee and a lean secretariat. GOWA has identified 3 work streams to focus on. First of all, permitting, stakeholder management, and marine spatial planning. Second, market frameworks, financing, and market design. And finally, green jobs growth and supply chain cooperation. These work streams will cover activities such as briefings, knowledge sharing, sharing and potentially endorsing best practice across the stakeholder group. Where informational positions already exist, GOWA will seek to leverage these and bring them to a global audience. GOWA is working to align these activities so that outputs are produced at key moments. Here's a snapshot of some of those key moments. I'll highlight a few of them. At the Clean Energy Ministerial in GOWA in India in July, we'll take part in an official side event with SEM. Numbers have already been fed into the G20 process on offshore wind. At the Offshore Wind APAC conference, a GOWA discussion on supply chain collaboration will be convened. At UNGA, we'll see a high-level convening on the work stream 1. And finally, at COP28, we'll feature a ministerial and several side events. I look forward to the discussions today. Before the panel, I'd like to introduce to the stage our first intervention from one of the governments who are members of GOWA. It gives me great pleasure to invite Ioan Alexandru Pogea from Romania to the platform. Ioan, please join me.
Thank you, Roland, Bruce, for your preliminary and introductory remarks. My name is Ioan Pogea. I'm energy attaché within the Romanian PEMREP here in Brussels. I've been following energy for the last 13 years in Brussels. So I'm happy to provide you with some introductory remarks from our side. Well, Romania remains committed in our common European efforts to decarbonize the economy. We have a very well-balanced energy mix, including nuclear, coal, gas, renewables, but we already started decarbonization process, so we are phasing out coal from our energy mix, which means that other clean energy solutions will have to be put into the system. This is also the case of renewable energy. Romania recently joined GOWA, so we are a new member. At national level, we are working, our authorities are working towards developing a legal framework for offshore wind development. To my knowledge, there is a study run by the World Bank indicating that there is high potential of offshore wind, theoretical capacity of offshore wind in the Black Sea. I think around 76 gigawatts. And then you have fixed and floating turbines. I think I have the numbers here. So 22 gigawatts in the form of fixed turbines and 54 in the form of floating turbines. So as a new member of GOWA, we see this as a good platform for exchange of views, best practices. Of course, there is an interest from our authorities to engage in a constructive and open dialogue with the relevant authorities of the member states that are in a more, let's say, in a more advanced phase when it comes to offshore wind. It's onshore, it's one thing, but I think offshore it's much more complicated. And I can only think that there has to be an engagement of different competent authorities, agencies, especially I think when you also have oil and gas offshore operations. So I only wonder how the interplay between different relevant agencies when it comes to offshore wind development has to develop. So therefore, I think GOWA will be one or maybe one of the right platforms for our authorities, stakeholders, whether it's private, public, to engage with their counterparts. So this is what I can tell you at this stage. We are new members, but a lot of efforts need to be put in the process towards 2030. And I think when it comes to numbers, this needs to be properly assessed in the upcoming national energy and climate plans. There is a process of updating those plans. I think it's then when we will have a more clear picture on how things will develop. But I think first we need to set up a legal framework. We are working on a draft law. I think this will then set up the right incentive for the relevant actors to come and develop in the Black Sea the right offshore wind capacities. Thank you all, and yeah, good luck today with your event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ioan. And it's an absolute honor to have you as a member of GOWA. And your statement about setting clear targets, having the right regulatory frameworks in place is exactly what GOWA is about. So any assistance and collaborative support we can provide will be a pleasure. So now we have the honor to introduce, she is joining remotely, Ana Andrade, Senior Policy Officer from Portugal. Ana, can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can very clearly. Ana, thank you very much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Is it the sound okay? Thank you so much for inviting me and for accepting me online. Would you please pass for the next slide? This is an obvious statement, but offshore wind has a acknowledged role in the national energy systems. Of course, it offers greater capacity factors than onshore, increased stability in the power profile of the energy mix, especially if hybridized with the conversion to other forms of energy, flexibility services, namely those associated with the production of green hydrogen, leading to new technological configurations and new business models, such as the respective logistics, for example, avoiding the need for submarine electrical infrastructure. Particularly with floating platforms, offshore wind is progressing into new regions, generating industrial clusters, bringing economic value, social value to coastal areas, while showing a concern for environment, social and economic stability. The private sector has been producing abundantly expressions of interest for offshore wind projects, creating a significant potential for new developments with new technologies, which is equivalent to the setting up of test labs with impact at the international level. Could you please pass the slide, please? Thank you. As the Atlantic Ocean gets very deep close to the Portuguese coast, floating foundations for offshore wind will be required in most of Portuguese waters. A landmark in the progress into that technology was and has been, since it continues in operation, the deployment of the first floating European wind farm named Windfloat Atlantic, located at the north of Portugal, with 5 megawatts of capacity from 3 wind turbines. Another landmark we consider in the structure of the sector in Portugal is its adhesion to GOWA, which happened also recently in the end of last year. Next slide, please. As you can see, next slide, please. Yes. As you can see in the bottom left chart, in 2021, the final energy consumption mix in Portugal contained 34% of renewables. 18% of this share was due to wind energy, largely as electricity generated onshore. The top left chart shows the electricity production mix in Portugal, where you can see wind as the second major source of renewable electricity, totaling 5.7 terawatt of installed capacity. And it alternates with hydro in the top position in producing electricity, becoming the major source of renewable electricity in years with less rain. Both of them contribute around 80% to the Portuguese electricity production. Cool. And the chart on the right shows the international landscape, where in 2021, Portugal was positioned at fourth place as the European Union country with higher incorporation of renewable sources in electricity. Next slide, please. Expectations for the future of energy systems across European Community member states have been expressed through their national energy and climate plans for 2030, which, following European Community rules, are currently under revision. This table shows data from the Portuguese National Energy and Climate Plan the plan set in 2020 concerning the evolution of installed capacity for onshore and offshore wind. In the onshore case, since best spots for turbines are occupied and they increase the pressure over the landscape, we notice new projects are scarce. So from the ongoing revisions of the National Energy and Climate Plan, probably the onshore target for 2030 will remain the same, concentrated offshore, the expected and very much needed wind energy deployment. The growth of the deployment. As such, an ambitious target for offshore wind deployed capacity in 2030 is being considered for Portugal in the current revision of this plan. The reason behind this aspiration is that the first auction, planned 2023 or the beginning of 2024, will initiate a learning curve that will likely and luckily create a large growth potential. This is an optimistic vision. However, if targets in this plan become a reality, the modeling of the energy system shows it will allow anticipating from 2030 to 2026, reaching 80% of renewable sources in the gross energy consumption of electricity. Next slide, please. We can also see in the National Energy and Climate Plan for 2030, set in 2020, the Portuguese one, a target of having 47% of renewables in the gross final energy consumption mix, surpassing the 45% target proposed in this figure in the revised Renewable Energy Directive and REPowerEU. This is in line with the consistent attention directed to the offshore sector, translated in several roadmaps and national strategies which have been published in Portugal. These listed are the most recent ones. Next slide, please. A big impulse was given recently to the sector at national and European levels. European policy packages, such as concerning the Renewable Energy Directive and REPowerEU, are already guiding national legislation updates. Portugal's legal framework was which was produced in 2022, was already anticipating several proposals which were not enforced by law, which is still under revision from Renewable Energy Directive and Repower EU. This legislation was mainly directed to simplify permitting, improving regulation for the deployment of hybrids, for example, wind and waves, wind and floating solar photovoltaic, and to storage. Behind that, the aspiration deployment target for offshore wind was seconded by the design of areas for auctions directed at renewables with origin or location in the ocean, as well as a concrete plan for grid and ports infrastructure expansion. This map on the left shows areas which went into public consultation in the beginning of this year, and the final version for them is now about to be released. Just to finalize, a short mention that inside the top area, near the location of the Windfloat Athletic Farm in the North Portugal, a part of this area will be reserved to be a test zone for pilots and for subsystems of offshore renewable energy technologies. Thank you so much. It's all from my side. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for the short interventions here from Ion Pogea from Romania and from Ana Andrade from Portugal. I would like to invite now a great panel for a panel discussion. We have here first Hans van Steen. Hans is Principal Advisor for an integrated renewable energy strategy towards the 2050 carbon neutrality objective in the Directorate-General for the Energy in the European Commission. Please, Hans, come here on stage. He joined the European Commission in 1989 with multiple assignments in the field of international relations and renewable energies since then. As next guest, we have a panelist, we have Ruud de Bruyne. Ruud is Program Manager, Offshore Wind Energy and Energy Systems at the Netherlands Enterprise Agency, which is part of the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Policy. Please, Ruud, if you just come next. And then we have, further on, we have Pierre Tardieu. He is the Chief Policy Officer at Wind Europe, and he leads the Wind Europe's policy department covering advocacy, innovation, market intelligence, and stakeholder engagement. Pierre is also co-manages the Renewable Hydrogen Coalition, the Energy Storage Coalition, and the Renewable Energy Source. I also would like to invite Jorgens Koff-Mose-Madsen. He is the head of regulatory and public affairs for new markets and the EU in the Danish renewable energy developer Ørsted. He has worked in the energy sector for 10 years, mainly on regulatory frameworks for offshore wind deployment, as well as for other renewable energy technologies. I have a little bit of a problem here with my mic. I hope you can hear me. I would like to start with the questions here directly with Hans van Steen. One moment. The European Commission launched the Repower EU initiative last year to decrease the reliance on imported fossil fuels and promote the renewable energy adoption. Other recent milestones also include adopting acts under the Renewable Energy Directive to ensure renewable fuels of non-biological origin are produced from renewable electricity and count towards member state targets. As a question, we would like to know from you, how does offshore wind contribute to the achievements of the EU's ambitious targets for renewable hydrogen and the directives pertaining to renewable fuels of non-biological origin? Also furthermore, how do recent policy developments act as an incentive for member states to accelerate the deployment of offshore wind?
Thank you very much, Roland, and good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here today. And I think in your introduction, your kind introduction to me, you already hinted at I joined the Commission quite a long time ago. So I don't think it's a big secret if I say you, when I was the head of unit for renewable energy in DG Energy, and I stopped about 10 years ago, the discussion about offshore energy was sort of a niche discussion. It was sort of interesting. Yes, there was a potential, but it was also seen as something a little bit more exotic. What we've seen in the last 10 years is a complete change of that. Really, really completely different scenario that we're facing. We have an enormous momentum for offshore wind, as we have for renewables more generally, which is good because renewables together with energy efficiency are really what needs to bring us to the decarbonization objective by 2050. So it is essential that we continue and further accelerate the deployment of all renewables, and offshore play an increasingly large role in all of that. Can I also just from the outset thank Irina, GOWA, very good introduction by Bruce, and the other organizers of this meeting here this morning. I think it's great that we have a session dedicated to offshore. When I say that there's an enormous momentum, I think it's fairly clear that what we see now also member states planning on, it's a different story than just a few years ago. As I think was already mentioned, we have a combined agreement by member states to deploy 111 gigawatts by 2030. 2030 is, in energy terms, almost tomorrow. So I think this is enormously ambitious if you compare it with what we have today. We welcome that very, very much in the Commission. We are very pleased the fact that we have now a regulatory framework, because that at the end of the day is what is really required in order to make this a reality. One thing is setting the targets, another thing reaching the targets. I think this is common knowledge, but we need that regulatory framework, and I think we have a lot of the pieces starting to fall into place. We have a preliminary agreement of the Renewable Energy Directive, RED III as we call it, which will set new rules on tender visibility, on permitting, an updated target, which is not exactly what the Commission proposed, but almost. So that's certainly a big step forward. We have new rules about trans-European energy networks, which also very clearly identifies offshore as a growth area and an area we need to focus on, and we may come back to the issue of grids. We have the whole industrial aspect of this development covered by the Net Zero Industry Act. Again, really, really important, and offshore wind is there identified as one of the strategic energy sectors that we need to focus on. So there's the framework, the regulatory framework, which will create the necessary certainty and stability for the massive investments, is shaping up. What we now need to do is to make sure that this is correctly implemented, and of course the Commission will do its job in terms of enforcing that as well. You also asked about hydrogen. Of course, hydrogen is an important piece of the puzzle when we talk about decarbonization, because we cannot electrify everything. There's a very strong link between renewables and hydrogen, because the hydrogen we want is the hydrogen coming from renewable energy. So we need, in addition to all the renewables we need to decarbonize electricity use as such, we also need a lot of additional renewable electricity to fuel the hydrogen plants, the electrolyzers. Offshore is really promising in that sense. It will help us decarbonize, it will help us reduce the dangerous dependence we still have about for certain types of fossil fuels, including from Russia. And I think we have already now created a part of the regulatory framework for hydrogen with the 2 delegated acts, which are about to be published in the EU official journal, hopefully in the days to come. But in addition, there is the whole issue about the market rules for hydrogen, the infrastructure rules for hydrogen, similar to what we have for gas and electricity that need to be in place, and that's coming with the package on decarbonization, gas and hydrogen. So this is really, really important. So from the Commission side, we are fully aware of our responsibility to set common rules for the regulatory framework for this development to take place. We know that it's difficult. It's also difficult for those that have to implement the rules. The member states are probably struggling. There's also a limit to how much we can do from the Commission side, although I think what we saw last year with the energy crisis was almost an unlimited ability to put forward emergency legislation, much of which, by the way, is also affecting renewables, and we hope in a positive way, of course. So let me leave it there in order not to take too much of the time. But I think, really to sum up, the momentum for offshore is there, and we need to build on that.
Thank you very much, Hans, for this very important insights. It's also a pleasure to see that the European Union now goes in terms of offshore wind into the right direction, and also the integration with the production and creating markets for green hydrogen is a pleasure to hear. I think the key challenge is probably with this ambition to integrate the offshore wind with the grid systems along the European coast. Can you give some insight of what the Commission plans to address the grid integration challenge for this ambitious growth in offshore wind?
It's a very important point, and we have to make sure that the renewables deployment offshore goes hand in hand with the building up of a resilient and strong electricity grid, because without that, of course, there's absolutely no point. It's not possible for grids to become the bottleneck for the development of offshore wind. We see costs coming down for the actual technology, which is part of the reason why development is going so fast, but we need to make sure that the infrastructure is in place there. We already have a couple of new instruments in place. One is the so-called ONDPs, the Offshore Network Development Plans by member states. It's an important addition to what we already have in terms of development plans for grid onshore, but there is a specific need to create this more long-term certainty and to make sure that member states are fully focused and have a rational planning process in place for how to develop this type of grid offshore, because everybody, the developers, the investors, need that kind of certainty in order for that to happen. What is missing is maybe some of the environmental impacts. We need to make sure that we are also able to address those. That comes now with the new permitting rules under the Renewable Energy Directive, and also the emergency regulation addresses that. But again, this is important because, of course, there are environmental impacts of this. We should not close our eyes and say, okay, now we're just rolling out offshore wind and not take into account other space uses of the maritime shelves. So I think that is really, really important to get that done. And then for the grids itself, I mean, from the Commission side, we are fully in favor of a interconnected offshore network. We think that is really important. It's clearly less cost. It's more energy security, because if there is a problem with one connection, if you have an interconnected grid also offshore, it clearly helps dispatch the energy in a way that makes sense. There are the whole issue about the bidding zones, which are really important. We need to have offshore bidding zones. That is coming now with the electricity market design, which I didn't mention before, but that's another very important piece of legislation currently under negotiations. You may have followed the discussions. It was on the agenda for the ministers when they met this week in Luxembourg. They didn't quite manage, so the discussions are still ongoing. But there is in that package of proposals, some of which, by the way, has been agreed. So there are still a few loose ends to tie up. Some of it has been agreed, but there are important rules there that will help us on the issue of offshore bidding zones, because that is really important. And then, as I said, this whole thing about accelerated permitting is really also very much something we need for the grid developments offshore, if we are to make sure that this will facilitate the necessary investments. I'll perhaps leave it there, but I'm sure some of the other panelists will have things to say on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you for this very, very good insights. Also at IRENA, in the context of our Global Offshore Wind Alliance, and on the global, the collaborative framework offshore wind, we did a brief together with GWEC on permitting. And indeed, let's say a big part of what is going to happen and what we will see on offshore wind in the water will be related to how good can we speed up the permitting process. I would like to come next to Ruud de Bruyne, who is Program Manager Offshore Wind for a state entity of the Netherlands. And Ruud has to leave a little bit earlier, so I would like to ask you, could you provide some examples where multi-stakeholder cooperation has led to the successful development of offshore wind energy systems in the Netherlands? And how do you see these ventures impact on the local economies and communities as an impact?
Thank you for that. Well, as a matter of fact, the whole system we developed in the Netherlands is based on multi-stakeholder involvement. The whole system was created in cooperation with the industry, in cooperation with the TSO, in cooperation with NGOs, etc. And that still goes on. It's for that reason quite successful. And one of the things we discovered when we designed this whole process is that we could identify very clearly which stakeholder was capable of managing certain risks in the best way. So for that reason, it is the government, different ministries, who are responsible for the whole consenting of the wind farms. So that risk is taken away from the developers, taken by the government. We thought, and Hans was already talking about the electrical infrastructure. There has to be built a grid at sea. We thought that our transmission system operator, TenneT, was in the best position to do that. I know that EUSEW thinks a little bit different about that, but that was our opinion. So TenneT is constructing that grid. And we recently have assigned the GasUnie as the TSO for the hydrogen grid, which also has to be built, of course. So then you asked also something about the effect on the local economy. Well, to be honest, when we started this program, and has always been quite successful, there were some concerns at the Ministry of Economic Affairs if it would create enough jobs. Nowadays, we're not so much afraid of that. We are more afraid of where do we get the people to do the work. We are already working on a very high speed, and one of the bottlenecks we are facing now is that we don't have enough people to do everything in the time frame we want to do it. That's one of the constraints. Another thing is that by 2030, we will have our current electricity system covered by renewables. That means that all the plants going beyond 2030 are no longer part of the electricity system, but part of the wider energy system, and that that must go hand in hand with other transitions, with electrification in the industry, and things like that. And another thing which also is related to this multi-stakeholder involvement is that we have to be realistic, and it is not just about putting up wind farms out in the sea. They have to fit into the ecological system. We're talking about such enormous volumes that circularity is really becoming a key issue, as well as system integration. Now, one of the success factors has been that the cost of offshore wind have come down dramatically, and so far we tend to stay away from auctions for the permits of the wind farms, and what we did is introduce what has been called now non-financial elements. So we have now a 4 gigawatt tender in preparation. 2 gigawatt will go to the tenderer with the best system integration plans, and the other 2 gigawatt goes to the tenderer with the best ecological measurements.
Thank you very much, Ruud, for these good insights. Indeed, infrastructure is very important, integrating and taking, let's say, involvement of the stakeholders. Also very important is what our Director-General, Francesco La Camera, says very often: to build up the workforce needed for this energy transition is a key thing, where a lot of attention is needed to make sure we have the people for this energy transition. There's people that say offshore wind is the new gold or is the new oil, to use it. The Netherlands has already implemented 2.5 gigawatt of offshore wind. They are planning to implement 21 gigawatt of offshore wind by 2030. How do you think this will impact the Netherlands? So what is the plan, what to do with all these offshore wind projects, also looking even forward to 2040?
Oh yes, it's in a way it's quite a challenge because we are bordering the busiest part of the North Sea. So finding room for all these wind farms is a challenge, but so far we have managed. We are in a very good position. You have to bear in mind that the success in the Netherlands also is related to the fact that the part of the Dutch sector of the North Sea is very shallow. So we're talking about water depth of 30, 40 meters maximum. It's a sandy soil, so we can use relatively cheap monopile foundations, which can be piled into the seabed quite easily. And we have the load centers at our coastline. So when the electricity comes on land, we don't have to transport it many kilometers into the land. So that makes it also quite ideal for wind energy. We see that especially in the harbors we have in the ports we have in the Netherlands, there we see a lot of economic development, not only restricted to the Netherlands. Dutch ports are also used for installation works in the UK and in Germany. So in general, we are quite happy with this development, yes.
That's a good and wealthy development coming from renewable energies. Very important to have those cases. I would like to come to Pierre Tardieu, who is the Chief Policy Officer. Sorry?
If I may, because I have to apologize for leaving now, but we are under a quite high pressure from politicians who wants us to deliver more and faster. So, and that's why one of the reasons I have to leave, because.
Okay, thanks for the good contribution, and have a safe trip home to the Netherlands. I would like to come to Pierre Tardieu, who is Chief Policy Officer at Wind Europe. And so Wind Europe has made significant strides in advancing wind energy across the continent, bringing together members from every sector of the wind energy value chain. And I would like to ask you, what specific role do you believe offshore wind energy can play in addressing Europe's energy and climate crisis, and how can this be enhanced?
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty clear, right? Offshore wind is highly scalable. It can go very fast, very big, right? And so as we try to shift our energy system from a model where we import a lot of fossil fuels to an energy system that's essentially based on renewable electricity, we just need to pump out a lot of green electrons in the electricity grid. And offshore wind is ideally placed to do that, because it has the high capacity factors, because you can do bottom fixed, you can do floating, you can tap into a massive resource that is out there across the continent. What can we do to get more, right? And to go faster? I think, I'd like to pick up on a few points that were made here and there. What Ruud was explaining about the success story of the Netherlands is very important, and is something that we need to build on. What the Dutch government did is they gave a very, very clear framework, and they set very clear objectives with a very clear timeline. And this is the model that we need to replicate going forward, that help drive cost reduction very fast. And now offshore wind is incredibly competitive. And what they've done more recently, which is what Ruud was explaining just before he left, is this introduction of non-price criteria in auctions, where to the point that you were making, Hans, it's not only about building big and fast, but it's also building the project that makes the most sense for society, that contributes to energy system integration, that contributes to biodiversity protection. And by basically combining all these things, offshore wind can really play a central role here in this energy security strategy. What we need to do now is, because the political commitment is there, we saw this in Ostend at the North Sea Summit, this commitment to build 120 gigawatts by 2030, having all those heads of states and governments, basically coming together and really endorsing this is great. But now let's boil down on the individual challenges. And we've got three main ones. The first is the investment signals, making sure that the electricity market design actually favors investments in renewable power generation. We need to ensure that measures that were taken in a time of crisis do not become permanent, because if you put in there a cap on revenues for generators, the investments will simply not happen. So that's the first thing, investment signals. Second is the grids. We talked about it, and here the European Commission made a very important proposal to help unlock investments in these offshore hybrids that combine generation and interconnectors. These are important because they help to balance the energy system, they save space, they save money, they save a lot of copper, and by giving visibility to investors, to Ørsted and their competitors in offshore hybrids, we can really move forward here. And finally, third point is the supply chain. The supply chain, we already know that we've got bottlenecks for the accelerated deployment of wind. Today, we can do roughly 7 gigawatts of offshore wind per year with the existing supply chain that we've got in Europe. By the end of the 2020s, we need to go up to 20 gigawatts per year. Otherwise, we don't meet the targets. We've got bottlenecks with vessels, with offshore substructures, with substations, and we need a really laser-focused effort on addressing that. Perhaps the Net Zero Industry Act can help there by unlocking financing, EU funding financing, etc. But we really need to focus, because right now the discussions on the scope of the Net Zero Industry Act, adding this and that, is not really getting us in the right direction. So investment signals, grids, and supply chain, that'll help us get there.
That's a very nice summary of what is really needed to make sure we reach the level and the speed, the acceleration of implementing offshore wind, and supply chains you mentioned are important. The production capacity has to triple. Also critical materials is an important part of it. What I found quite interesting, and I wonder if you have a quick answer on this, you said we have to be sure that with the current energy crisis, we don't lock ourselves in framing down basically this speed we need now to implement the renewable energy capacities we need, and to speed up and build up the manufacturing capacities. You have a short answer there?
I mean, on that specifically, we need to make sure that there are different routes to market possible for those people who want to invest in offshore wind. Two-sided CFDs, okay, fine, yes, they will play a role. You need to make sure that it's as easy as possible to sign power purchase agreements for offshore wind farms with the demand, and selling directly in the market. We need merchant investments too, otherwise the equation does not work, right? And having that stable regulatory framework, making sure that investors have those different routes to market, are able to be creative in developing their business models, that is going to be absolutely essential. If we don't have that, the whole discussion is academic.
Okay, very good. What other policy changes are currently faced in Europe that are inhibiting the acceleration of offshore wind energy adoptions, in your opinion?
Okay, well, let's share a little bit of good news here. I mean, Hans was talking about the almost formalized adoption of the Renewable Energy Directive. Yeah, and so this is really enshrining very important principles that will help, we think, speed up the permitting of renewables and offshore wind in particular. Considering renewables to be in the overriding public interest, clarifying that the binding deadlines for permitting include all the individual, permits, the evaluation of the environmental impact assessment, the grid connection permit, the building permit, et cetera. All that needs to be done within the mandated time frame. And a population-based approach to biodiversity. And I think it's important to address that. The industry, and perhaps Jürgen will may add something here, but the industry takes environmental protection extremely seriously, which is why Wind Europe and many of our members are involved in this dialogue with nature protection NGOs and with the transmission system operators. It's something called the Ocean Platform, the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature, to really understand the impact of offshore wind on the environment, on nature, and to minimize and compensate wherever necessary, so that we do this in a way that makes sense for society and for nature.
Okay, so you clearly see what are the challenges, what needs to be done. Just a question, what is Wind Europe doing about it?
We're in the middle of all this, of course, yes. I mean, trying to contribute basically ideas, proposals, convening the various parties, and basically trying to make sure that there's an alignment between the big targets, the big policy objectives, and the actual measures that are put on the table, and actually their delivery.
Thank you very much for this very good contribution. I would like to come now to Jürgen Madsen. He's head of the new markets and the European Union at Ørsted, a very important wind energy developer and operator. Recently, Ørsted released a report detailing the barriers hindering Europe's shift toward a greener future. Central to these challenges are the dearth of investments in supply chains and the prevailing fiscal and regulatory uncertainties. I wonder if you could elaborate on the specific fiscal and regulatory uncertainties that are currently posing challenges to the growth of the offshore wind industry in Europe, please.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so, and thank you very much for the invitation to GOWA, to IRENA. I think Pierre has already. We are a member of Wind Europe as well, and it's very, very comforting to hear Pierre talk and say so many intelligent things. I can subscribe to all of them. I think from a developer point of view, what we can do to help the supply chain is basically to make concrete orders to fill up their order books. This is not a challenge only for the supply chain. It's a challenge for the whole sector if manufacturing capacity is not sufficient to meet those pretty ambitious targets. And maybe I should start with that because we should also not be too negative here. We have had recent declarations for a massive offshore wind build-out in the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. We see very positive developments. I don't know if the colleague Ms. Andrade from Portugal is still online, but we see very sort of concrete movement in Portugal with ambitious targets, as you mentioned, and also very serious work going on in 3 different working groups that were finalized by the end of May. What we need in a market like that is to have a little bit more visibility on when will the tenders actually come and how will they look. Here we have seen in quite recent times in Denmark up to 14 gigawatts being auctioned within the next couple of years. In Germany, we will have 7 gigawatts auctioned next week. Actually, the auction will start, and the colleague from the Netherlands also mentioned the 4 gigawatts to be auctioned there, and those kind of volumes being auctioned at one time gives a lot of flexibility to us as developers. If we win, we know that we will have that exclusivity for a certain period of time. That means we can start negotiating with the supply chain, and we can start placing orders, which enables them to scale up their manufacturing capacity. Because that has really been the problem, that there has not been those concrete projects which has allowed us to fill the order books of the manufacturers. There have been a lot of declarations and a lot of ambitions, which is great, but it's really only now we start to see those ambitions being implemented, and hopefully we will see the same as a follow-up to the Fit for 55 package, which Hans and other people have negotiated. So really, on ambition, it's looking very, very good. On implementation, it's looking better and better. That doesn't mean that there are not challenges still for us to place orders with the supply chain. Pierre already mentioned the issue of, and so did Hans, by the way, of infrastructure. That is a big concern for us, that infrastructure is not being built fast enough. We very much agree to the issue of offshore hybrids and the transmission access guarantees that have been proposed by the European Commission. This is really the next generation of offshore wind farms, where instead of connecting an offshore wind farm just to one market, you connect them to 2 or more markets at the same time. However, this enables, or this doesn't enable it, it creates a completely different risk profile for those offshore wind farms, and that needs to be reflected in European regulation. And it's not today, but I think the Commission has made a good proposal with the transmission access guarantees. One more thing on infrastructure. A lot of the interconnectors that have been built so far in Europe has been sort of win-win interconnectors. Just as one very local example for me, being from Denmark, the Norwegian-Danish interconnector is a piece of copper that allows Denmark to export a lot of electricity to Norway when the wind is really blowing in Denmark, and we have a lot of wind energy. That means that they can keep the water levels higher in Norway. When the wind is not blowing, they can export hydropower to us. So it's sort of a win-win interconnector. In the future, we will probably see more interconnectors where the electricity more flows one way all the time. If you take Denmark as an example, we have potential for very, very large build-out of renewable energy, especially offshore wind. But we don't have a lot of consumption. We don't have a lot of heavy industry in Denmark. So a lot of that electricity will have to be exported to the Benelux or to Germany probably. So there, it's maybe not so much a win-win. But we still need those interconnectors because they create European added value. And here, there will soon, actually yesterday, the European Commission announced a revision, or let's say a review of the multi-annual financial framework, so basically the EU budget. And we actually see a very, very big role here for the EU budget in going in and being that lever for the financing of such infrastructure projects. Today it's around 0.5% of the EU budget that is allocated to trans-border infrastructure. So 0.5% of something that is so high on the political agenda, and everyone agrees is highly, highly important. We think that needs to be increased going forward, both on the short term, but certainly also when the new MFF will be negotiated in the next EU mandate. So I could say much more. I don't know if I should maybe take a break.
No, I just wonder, our Director-General, Francesco La Camera, often says, let's say, fossil fuels would be as interruptive as renewable energies if we would not have taken 150 years to build up the infrastructure and to train the workforces to deal with the interruptions and the variability that comes from fossil fuel. And in this sense, Irina makes the point in saying it's very important to build up the infrastructure that makes renewable energies part of the system, which is not intermittent. And you said, let's say what we see, what happens in building up the infrastructure is now far too slow to, let's say, what the plans are. So what do you think, what can be done to strengthen the infrastructure build up to make sure, and I think it was also said before, and saying we have to increase the production capacities threefold in the coming years, so until 2030, which is not a very long time. And we have also to build up the infrastructure that can carry these renewable energy projects. How can this be done, and what can a private sector company do about?
Yeah, well, I think one thing is what I just mentioned, that I'm not at all suggesting that the EU budget can finance interconnected build out all over Europe. It's more sort of being that lever that creates the space for member states to negotiate an agreement on the sharing of costs and benefits when you build such an interconnector. I think another important issue is both ACER, the European Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators, and also national regulators, they often don't, I'm not sure if any of them do, but I think often they don't have any sort of net zero element in their mandates. So that means that they are assessing infrastructure projects based on cost only, and often very short-term cost. But we know, if we can trust what the EU politicians and the national politicians have agreed, we know where we need to be in 2050. And that somehow also needs to be better incorporated in the regulation of those agencies and regulators.
So the role of ACER would be to harmonize the regulation in Europe, and I can imagine Ørsted as a European and global player. In each of these markets, you face different regulations, and let's say you have to work with these challenges. How do you work, and how do you deal with this?
I mean, I don't know if we need total harmonization of all regulations of national regulators. It's more sort of the basic principle that you need to assess infrastructure projects according to a general net zero target, and for the electricity sector, it will need to be much before 2040. I would mention also one more thing, which was also touched on before. We will not be able to transport all of this renewable energy through the electricity system, so we will need a hydrogen backbone to be able to transport hydrogen across borders in some cases as well. I flew down here today on a flight from Copenhagen. We have a project near the airport of Copenhagen called Green Fuels for Denmark, where we aim eventually to build or to produce e-kerosene for Copenhagen Airport. And those type of projects, those type of hydrogen projects, they still require funding, and that is something that both authorities and politicians also need to accept. I think they do to a large extent, but there's been increases in capital of cost, of inflation, and so on. There is still a cost gap there, and if we don't get that those kind of projects over the line, then I think we will have a problem with the hydrogen economy, or let's say the hydrogen industry, and the innovations that they need to bring potentially happening elsewhere than in Europe. So it's really also about thinking not only the electricity system as such, but thinking across different energy vectors.
Thank you, Jorgen, for sharing your views. Given the time, we are very close to the end of this session. I have here from the audience 3 questions. I think for them, some of them we already discussed. So there is one question, is there already standards emerging from first projects in the North Sea that can be used to let's say for new upcoming projects? And let's say the question is related to the biggest challenges and opportunities, and now from the experience gained by implementation of offshore wind projects, are there any first standards that are emerging from the first implemented projects?
I can say a little. I don't know if I can say so much about the standards, but I think there are really positive developments in terms of what Pierre mentioned, and also the colleague from the Netherlands, in terms of how do we integrate nature protection more in the way we develop our wind farms. I think until now, wind energy or offshore wind energy has been such a nascent industry that you have member states and or countries have maybe allowed themselves to say, oh, we need to figure out what this is. But now we are starting to see if those are the scales that we need, then we need to incorporate that in the way we do tenders, either as a competitive element as they do in the Netherlands, or as minimum standards for those who decide to bid in these tenders. So I think there's not standards yet, but there's a lot of work going into how do you actually measure biodiversity, how do you measure the GHG impact, or let's say the greenhouse gas impact throughout the supply chain of an offshore wind farm. And those kind of developments are very, very important and will be crucial for the offshore wind sector to, let's say, deliver on what is needed.
There's another question. There's maybe a question for Hans. So as we all know, offshore wind is having, like every other energy form, has an environmental impact, has impact on the stakeholders. What needs to be done to get public acceptance of offshore wind projects? What is done in the European Union Commission for this?
I think there's already quite a high acceptance of renewables more generally. This has changed. I mean, everybody, including through what happened last year, has seen that the future has to be renewable. We cannot continue to rely on fossils, not only for climate reasons, maybe especially for climate reasons, depending on where you sit and how you see it, but also simply for our strategic dependence. It cannot continue that we can be blackmailed the way that we have been in terms of fossil fuel from Russia imports. That's very, very clear, and I think there is a common understanding of that. That said, of course, everybody also sees that there's an impact from renewables, and this is not just offshore, this is all renewables. They have some type of environmental impact, and that's why when we say that we need faster permitting, that doesn't mean that you simply ignore the environmental impact assessment. It just means, as Pierre was explaining, that we need a more rational process. We need to have more one-stop shops so that you conduct these assessments in one go and can reduce the overall length of this period that we need in order to make sure that we get the most for our investments in terms of renewable energy with the least negative environmental impact. But we have also to accept that there will be environmental impacts. And again, we need also to recognize that the biggest environmental threat to the planet is climate change. And climate change can only be resolved if we have a dramatic change of our energy systems away from fossil fuels. And there, the workhorse in that system has to be two things: renewable energy and energy efficiency. That's, I think, agreed universally, and we simply need to make that happen, and we need to follow suit with our regulatory environment on that front. Can I just say one thing on the previous question? I think what is important here is that as we see this enormous momentum on renewables happening, it also means that the benefits tend to be more regionalized. So when we had the first developments of offshore, it was sort of a point-to-point connection, and you had the offshore installation, and then the electricity was being used to where. When we have a more integrated system, we have hybrid interconnections and so on, there will be a more regionalized system where the benefits will also become regional. And for that, of course, we need to think about how not only the benefits, but so the costs are shared. This is very clear from the Commission's point of view. It doesn't necessarily mean that we need to have new legislation. We have already announced that we will come with guidance next year on this. I think that is important, but we think the legislative framework is there, but we are fully aware that that is something that we need to make sure is implemented in the right way.
Thank you very much. Pierre, you wanted to add something, or?
Just a quick point to reiterate. I mean, the acceptance for renewables is very high, but every single project has its own specific challenges, right? And so when you go out at sea, of course, there are many users of the sea out there. There's shipping, fishermen, etc. And so you need to engage those communities early and through a very transparent and diligent process. But even before then, what's really critical is to get their maritime spatial planning right. And not to consider offshore wind as a last, person coming to the table, but really to embed the volumes of offshore wind that we need to go to net zero already from the start. Yeah, and so now the European Commission has asked national governments to do this, maritime spatial planning. All coastal states are undergoing that, and that'll be extremely helpful going forward.
I have one last very interesting question also for me personally. We have now these targets on offshore wind. We start the implementation. We triple basically the manufacturing capacity for offshore wind. Is anyone considering already the end of the lifetime of those wind energy projects, and what aspects of circularity are now considered, also while we discuss supply chains and critical materials? How far is this playing as a role now while we are ramping up the implementation and of offshore wind projects?
I can say a quick word on that, and then Jürgen representing the developers perhaps, but just to say, offshore wind is growing very fast, but it started already in 1991. Yeah, so we're already starting to decommission the first wave of offshore wind projects. Circularity is completely embedded in the thinking of the industry, which is why we're starting to see, for example, the first fully recyclable offshore wind blades hitting the market, because it's great, of course, to produce green energy, but we want the entire life cycle to have as light a footprint as possible. And so I think this is going to continue going forwards, but it's already embedded in the mindset of the industry.
You want to add here, Jürgen?
I fully agree to this, and we are working with some of our colleagues or competitors also to develop a common standard for such life cycle assessments. And I think that could fit very well into the negotiations that are going on right now in the Net Zero Industry Act, where you have sort of an increased focus on non-price factors. And I think this is an obvious thing to, again, either set as a minimum standard or something to compete on, and in that way unlock, let's say, the innovative forces of a company like ours. So absolutely very, very important.
Is the Commission thinking of setting up a regulation that supports circularity aspects on offshore wind implementation?
Circularity for us is absolutely essential. The circular economy as a concept is fully embedded in practically everything we do. Whether we need a specific framework for circularity for offshore, I think is a different question. And I think we rely there also on the industry to consider these aspects, because it is very clearly something that you cannot ignore. It needs to be understood that, you know, every project has a natural lifetime, and at the end of that we need to be circular in our way of dealing with it. And from the Commission side and especially our colleagues in DG Environment, they're pushing hard on that front as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. A big hand to the panelists for their very good contributions. I would like to hand over to my colleague Bruce Douglas, who makes the closing remark on behalf of the Global Wind Energy Council. Please, Bruce.
Thank you very much, Roland. I think it's going to be difficult to beat the fantastic conclusion that Hans just mentioned. The future has to be renewable and efficiency, and offshore wind is the workhorse behind that. Delighted to represent the Global Wind Energy Council here and GOWA, and really this is just the beginning of the journey of GOWA. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we draw the curtains on this compelling event, let us reflect on the magnitude and gravity of the discussions we've had today. We have gathered under the banner of a shared belief, the belief in the potential of offshore wind, its vital role in the European energy transition, and its vast contribution towards securing our planet's future. The urgency of our situation is now clear. Climate change and energy security are the twin challenges that demand our immediate attention. They're not just environmental issues, but they are questions of societal survival and economic resilience. And in the eye of this storm, offshore wind energy stands as a beacon of hope. It's not just a means of generating power, but a tool to drive jobs, stimulate economies, and foster technological innovation. The European Union's commitment to the Paris Agreement and its ambitious goals for renewable energy and decarbonisation all point towards the primacy of offshore wind energy. Today, we've underscored the importance of supporting this sector through effective policy frameworks. Our discussions have explored how the EU can enhance its support to realise the full potential of offshore wind power. The Global Offshore Wind Alliance vision, as presented today, resonates with this goal. It's heartening to see how GOWA is stepping forward and bringing together political will and expertise to advance this crucial sector. It's encouraging to envision an alliance that's set to be a leading force, shaping policy and driving innovation, thus bringing markets to maturity. Today, we opened our doors to welcome new partners to this mission, and our discussions highlighted the opportunities that offshore wind energy presents, not just for governments, but also for the private sector. Our panelists brought to light inspiring examples of collaboration, reinforcing the idea that united we are stronger and can achieve more. But let's not view today's event as a conclusion. Instead, it's a rallying call, a catalyst that sparks wider conversations and collaborations on offshore wind energy across the European continent and beyond. Let's carry the momentum we've built here today out into the world. Let this event serve as a springboard, propelling us towards a sustainable, low-carbon future. And in closing, I express my deepest gratitude to all the participants, to the speakers and partners who contributed to this enlightening day and to GOWA's success. You are the driving force behind making the transition to a sustainable, secure energy future a reality. Thank you very much.